Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And my guest today is distinguished Dark Ages knower of things person, Jacob K. Jacob, how you doing? And how did you get involved in World of Darkness games, and I guess specifically the Dark Ages?
I'm doing fine, coming off a bout of COVID, but I should be.
Oh, no.
well, at least I didn't get hit that hard. Had all my shots and everything, but I'm doing fine right now. I got involved with the whole playing Dark Ages basically when I started playing World of Darkness, because I had a friend who who was running Dark Ages. Actually, the first White Wolf game I ever played was Mage, but not as Mage. I had a friend who had the first edition core book, and he used it as a sort of generic game for running horror games. And then we got a hold of some of the first Vampire second edition books, and he started a vampire game. And we'd been playing a lot of Ars Magica, which I assume a lot of Mage fans will at least be somewhat familiar with. And so he decided to start our vampire game in the Middle Ages, and that was really, really cool. And then when Dark Ages came out, I thought, all right, well, I got to get a hold of this. And it quickly became not just my favorite White Wolf game, but just my favorite game of all times. I mean, it's my one true love of role playing. If ever I would have to choose just one game to play, it would have to be Dark Ages, specifically Dark Ages Vampire. So yeah, it's a love affair that's lasted for 20 years.
So what period and I guess places does the Dark Ages refer to in the World of Darkness? And does that tie to mortal history as well? Like, is that period or term accurate?
Well, no. The Dark Ages is not the Dark Ages that the Dark Ages is set in. And in fact, the Dark Ages are not really the Dark Ages at all. That doesn't make much sense. But the term Dark Ages was one that was used by historians and archaeologists to describe Europe in the period after the fall of Rome, or rather the Western Roman Empire. Once again, we're getting into this whole idea that the Roman Empire never really fell. It was only the Western part that fell. And then there was this idea, I think it was started by the Victorians, because whenever you encounter some bad history, it was probably started by the Victorians. But that was this idea of it being a dark age lasting from the fall of the Western Roman Empire up until probably around the time of Charlemagne. But really, yes, there was, of course, a deterioration in overall centralization and government in Europe, but it's not really fair to call it the Dark Ages. So in modern terminology, you operate with the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. And the Dark Ages setting, it starts originally with Vampire, the Dark Ages in 1197. Then you have the second edition, Dark Ages Vampire, which is where Dark Ages Mage is also set. That is in 1230. And then the last edition, the 20th anniversary edition, ups the timeline to 1242. And all of that is in the time period that is called the High Middle Ages. I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I have spent some time looking into this sort of thing. So for other history nerds, when you say things like the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, they know what you're talking about. And the setting here is the High Middle Ages, which is, as one might expect, smack bang in the whole terminology of the Middle Ages, which is generally set to last from the year 500 to the year 1500. So you have a nice 1,000-year time span. And it is set in just like modern day White Wolf games are set in our world, tying in with mortal history. This is set in our world, tying in with our history. The general focus tends to be on Christian Europe.
So we're in the early 13th century, we're in the 1230s. What is kind of the state of the world at that time for regions where you feel comfortable talking about the state of the world at that time? What kind of is going around, what's happening in mortal history at that time?
Well, we have pretty much all of Western Europe has been Christianized. Catholic Christianity has taken over most of Europe. The Albigensian Crusade is over. And you have the rapid Christianization of places like Prussia and the Baltic lands, especially at the hands of the Teutonic Order of Knights. You have a rapid expansion of trade. This is when the Hanseatic League starts to kick off. You have rapid urbanization for the time. You have a lot of people moving into cities. You actually have sort of the first industrialized area emerging in Flanders, where an immense amount of English wool is being imported and turned into cloth. And you have these cities in Flanders with 20, 30, sometimes 40,000 inhabitants, which for that time period is insane north of the Alps. And you just have really a time of growth in Europe. And it's actually becoming a bit of a problem. The thing is, if we hadn't gotten 100 years from the time that this is set, if we hadn't gotten the plague, the Black Plague, then Europe would most likely have encountered some kind of famine, because at this point, populations were growing pretty much beyond the ability of the countryside to feed them. You have forests being cleared for new farmland, and you have a slow but still noticeable increase in things like science and scholarship. Because of the Crusades, both in what is today the Near East, the blanking out on the term.
West Asia, the Holy Land. Yeah.
Yeah, Palestine, the Holy Land, Outremer, as it was called back then. But also in Iberia, southern Iberia, what is today southern Spain, you have Christianity coming into contact with the Muslim Arab culture, which preserved a lot of the Greek and Roman scholarship. And that's being transported back. And so you also see the beginning of the big universities, Bologna, Oxford, Paris. These centers of learning are growing up around this almost, but not quite, renaissance of Greek scholarship. So it's really an interesting time of growth. And you can see the seeds being sown for the eventual Renaissance. And like I mentioned, you get the Black Plague 100 years later, and it's actually kind of a boon. Sure, millions of people die, but what it does is it reduces this overpopulation, and it gives a chance for Europe to bloom again. In the Middle East, you have the Crusader states being really under pressure, and further east, the Mongols are on their way, and they are really going to become a factor once they reach the Middle East.
We're still a couple of decades away from the Golden Horde arriving on the doors of Europe. So that talks about Europe. Can you give us a snapshot of maybe what is happening outside of what we would call the West at that time? And if that's beyond the scope of what you know, that's fine too.
Like I said, if you go further east, when you hit like the Baltics, you have crusades going on there. Basically, as soon as you get into the sort of the steppe lands further east, that's where the Mongols really are getting going. Indo-Persia is reacting to that. I'm not terribly familiar with Indo-Persian history. It's an area I would love to know more about. In the Middle East, you have a civil war brewing in the Ayyubid dynasty, which is the only reason why the Crusader states are surviving. But soon you'll see the rise of the Egyptian Mamluks, who will take control there. And if you go into North Africa, there's some trouble there because dynasties are taking over again and again, and the Berbers have not managed to unite as they have done before. You have the Muslims that had conquered southern Iberia, they're being pushed back, and the dynasty that rules Morocco, pretty much the strongest state in northern Africa, they have become, as so often happens, complacent, and they've become accustomed to luxury, and it won't be long. I can never remember if it's the Sassanids or whatever it is they're called, but they're going to be taken over soon by a new group called the Marinids. And it happens again and again. You see that in the Middle East, that you have some very religious people who really focus on Islam, and then they take over and become a new dynasty. And then 100 years later, they fall into decadence, and then a new dynasty arises. And that's sort of the circle that's happening in North Africa and in Muslim North Africa at this point.
And at this time, the Aztec and Mayan empires are active in the West, as well as the Incas, the Mapuche, the Guarani, the Ticuna are all spanning the Western world. You have, I guess, China at this point. You kind of have the Ming Dynasty and the Manchus and the Arats, who are kind of fighting with one another. Within Africa, you have Berbers still in control of fair parts of the Saharan plain. The Malian Empire is dominant in Western Africa. The Empire of Benin is in existence. I'm trying to think of any other.
Well, you're still 100 years away from the Mali Empire really rising up.
Okay.
Mansa Musa is 100 years away. At this point, if I recall correctly, the Mali Empire and the Ghana Empire are sort of slugging it out as to who becomes the victors in sub-Saharan West Africa. But yeah, and one thing that's very important that I think a lot of people don't realize is you have a huge interconnected web of trading routes, and trade, it's still going on no matter what's happening in the Middle East, no matter what's happening elsewhere. There might be wars, but trade is going to happen. And you see an emergence in Italy of new trading techniques, things like double ledger bookkeeping, things like that. You see gold coins slowly beginning to appear in Europe again. So you can see the sort of emergence of trade. And of course, outside of Europe, you still have a lot of wealth going on. I mean, it might not be the Dark Ages, but Europe is still, despite what's happening, it's still sort of the rural backwater. Anything west of the Byzantine Empire can generally be considered a rural backwater when compared to to much of the lands that surround it at this point.
And around this time in the 13th century, we see the invention of the rocket in China. The first mechanical escapements appear, ways of allowing a kind of a ratchet to move in one direction. In the 13th century, we get the arrival of the button in Germany. Just in case people think all the obvious inventions are taken, it took us several millennia between the invention of cloth and coming up with a fastener that didn't involve just putting it all around you. We're still at this point, I guess, another 60 years away from like the invention of eyeglasses.
Pockets haven't been invented yet.
Yeah.
Which is always a fun thing to remember when you're playing in the Middle Ages is people aren't putting things in pockets. There's no such thing as a pickpocket. Everything's being carried in pouches and purses.
Also in China, we have the development of explosives in a number of forms. The first kind of controlled pyrotechnics are being refined. We have the Yuan dynasty hand cannon that appears again sometime in this period. I am vastly more familiar with the history of technology by century than I am about any political history. Maybe that belies my interest in playing a historical technocrat. So in the West, what would be the big philosophical ideas in the air? Like, what are the dominant philosophies and worldview? And are there any, let's say, subversive ideas that are starting to make their way around during this time?
Yes, the universities, and especially the University of Paris, is getting a lot of flack from the Catholic Church. Now, Catholic Church dogma is, I won't say 100% settled, but certainly the orthodoxy of it has been hammered out now to the point where you don't really have the big debates that you would have in, say, the 5th, 6th, and 7th century. It is kind of fixed. And of course, the Albigensian Crusade, the Cathars was the big heresy. They've been put down. You have the Bogomils and various others, but they're never really going to be a big factor. The big one is going to be Protestantism. So what you have is the ideas of Aristotle and Neoplatonism. Those are the big things that are emerging within the universities, and they're receiving a lot of pushbacks from the church because although the church likes a lot of the scholarship, they don't like that it comes from pagan authors. You're also seeing the very, very first beginnings of Jewish Kabbalah, which is happening among the Sephardic Jews in Iberia, and also see in Iberia and also in France, kind of both acceptance and challenging of Jewish philosophy. You have these debates that are being arranged between prominent Catholic theologians and prominent Jewish philosophers, which unfortunately is never really picked up upon because there comes an upswing, especially in Spain. I think a lot of people knows this, of anti-Semitism. But it is a turning point where you could have a bigger integration of Jewish philosophical thought within Western Christian Europe. But unfortunately, you don't get that. So I think the big subversive elements at this point is really the introduction of Greek philosophy into a society that wants to accept it, but can't because it comes in from a pagan source.
So thinking about this, what I find interesting is kind of just to explain first, so we have the Cathars, who are this Christian dualistic, or at least Gnostic movement between kind of the 12th, and it took a bit to completely wipe it out, that was active in northern Italy and southern France. They were described themselves as the Cathars. They referred to themselves as the good Christians. They were, I guess, what we would call comparatively progressive.
Very much compared to the rest of Europe, they were surprisingly progressive.
Catharism plays an interesting role in the world of darkness. Can you give me a brief description of Catharism and maybe the weird place that pops up in the world of darkness? My thought is it does appear, I think, in one of the vampire philosophies, right?
It does indeed. Now, Catharicism was, as you said, a dualistic Gnostic belief. It was this whole idea, and you see it emerge in the earliest Christian theological philosophies, this idea that God is the creator, but if there is evil, can God have created this? No, then there must be a creator of evil. And then this whole dualism, where instead of having God as the supreme being, you have two equal supreme beings. You have God, and then you have, it could be Satan. It's often referred to as the demiurge or demiurgos. And God is the God and creator of all that is pure and all that is spiritual, because everything that is bad comes from the physical. Pain is physical, disease is physical, hunger is physical. And so that is the dualistic part of it. The Gnostic part of it, anyone who is a werewolf fan will know the term gnosis, or gnosis as it's often pronounced, which is wisdom and knowledge. So it is a sort of movement that is dedicated to wisdom and knowledge, but also the rejection of the physical, because the physical is bad. So you strive towards things like being a vegetarian, avoiding sex, all those things. And the Cathars were really great in that they realized that you can't really reproduce if you avoid sex. So you could have people who were perfecti or perfect, who lived up to this, but they didn't expect other people to live up to it, just to follow along. And then you could, once you were close to death, you could take an oath to become even more perfect, where you just swore off everything, not just sex, but also eating and drinking. If you died while you had taken this oath, and obviously there was a reason why you took it close to death, then you would be saved. And you have in Vampire the Masquerade, in the system of paths of morality, which is what vampires use to control their inner beast, you have a path of morality that is referred to as the path of Cathari, which sort of flips this on the head and says that since vampires are purely physical creatures, then they must indulge in all the physical. So it's sort of you are indulgent as much as you can possibly be, and eschew the more spiritual part of it.
I will never understand the paths of enlightenment, just because I'm just not that good at role-playing. So I appreciate that they are out there for other people. Why was the Albigensian heresy put down? I ask because I think this is a very direct war of ideas. And to me, one of the interesting things in Mage is it allows us to either have strange bedfellows, groups that get along that maybe we don't expect to, as well as the ability to carry out a war by other means. For whatever reason, in Mage 20, it specifically says, hey, we are presuming a world of darkness where Gnosticism never quite died out in the same way, and neither did Catharism. And I'm like, of all the things to posit, that's kind of fascinating. What was so damning, at least in the eyes of the Catholic Church maybe, to the Cathars, and was there a political angle to that at all?
The political angle came later. It started out with basically the Cathars saying the Catholic Church is corrupt, Rome is corrupt, the Pope is an instrument of Demiurgos, Satan. Just look at all the wealth and all the physicality and materialism in the Catholic Church. We reject that. We're not going to pay tithes. We're not going to let the Catholic Church appoint bishops. We're going to do that ourselves, which obviously the Catholic Church had to do something about, because it was a direct challenge to their power. And also, it was, in their eyes, people turning away from the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, thus damning their own souls. So in addition to putting down someone who challenged their power, they were actually trying to save souls. From their point of view, anyone who could be saved from Catharism would be saved from having their souls damned to hell. Incidentally, also was when you begin to see the first like real inquisitors, the friar inquisitors who were sent down to root out the heresy. But eventually, the church realized just how destructive this kind of crusade was. The sac of Foix was one of the big things where the Catholic Church realized just how destructive it was. But at this point, the French king had realized that this was an opportunity for him, because there is a tendency, I think, for people who hasn't studied the Middle Ages that much, to think of monarchs as being these all-powerful rulers of their land. And sometimes that was the case in the case of the King of France before the Albigensian Crusade. No, his control over the south of France, the Languedoc region, which is mainly Provence, it wasn't very strong. But after the Crusade, he suddenly had a lot more control over the land. So he took up the mantle. The Catholic Church never abandoned the Albigensian Crusade, but they pulled back. But then the King of France took up the slack, and more than just took it up, and managed to just completely and utterly eradicate all the nobles that either supported or tolerated the Albigensians, and either take their lands or hand it over to people that were loyal to him. So what started out as a more religious than political crusade certainly ended up more political than religious.
And so we've kind of outlined the dominant religious view. Philosophically, you mentioned that we have these ancient Greek ideas that are coming back, but from my understanding, there was kind of a strain of Neoplatonism or Platonic philosophy that has continued through that era. What was the state of that kind of view of knowledge in the world? I guess if you were a learned person, what did you consider to be the nature of knowledge and understanding? Like, what was the outside of religious doctrine? Was there a philosophical framework that most people were using to look at the world?
Those people who actually were invested in that sort of thing certainly had it. For your average peasant or merchant or tradesman, there was no real need to consider that. But yes, there was this idea that you had ancient people who were simply authorities on a subject. So any subject that you could mention that was worth studying, you generally divided study into trivium and quadrivium and theology, and I can't remember, and medicine, and I think law was also its own area. And every subject had an ancient master who knew everything, and what they'd written was sort of the authority on the area, and you could comment on that and you could sort of expand on it, but their knowledge was the basis, and that it was all encompassing, but you could sort of extrapolate from what they had. And what the universities were slowly beginning to challenge was this idea. It came in a little bit later, but there was an idea that perhaps you could actually know more than these ancient, usually Greek, sometimes Roman masters of their field. But the general idea was that everything there was to know, that you were allowed to know, was already discovered. You just had to rediscover and refine it. Obviously, there were things that you could not know. And that was religious things. There were things about God and the Trinity that was considered to be unknowable. And not that it stopped theologians from having huge debates as to what could be knowable and what could be unknowable.
Mm-hmm. In our mage world, there's a few things that are happening in kind of the hidden history. In AD 1200, in 1201, the first vampiric infestation of House Tremere led to the first Masasa War, which is full on raging at this time and will go for another 125 years. The Craft Mason Covenant came together to form the Craft Masons, kind of this group formerly of the Order of Hermes that would eventually become the Order of Reason. A lot of magic users are being moved across the Eurasian steppe. The Mongol shamans are bringing this kind of spiritualism into the West, and at the same time crushing the Akashics that are kind of in the way, along with the Toftani and other groups. The Daola Laoshi guilds are absolutely fascinated by the rise of rocketry. So if you kind of want that myth pulp action adventure setting. You can perfectly have that in an area set in the East. In the 1230s, we kind of get the rise of the Inquisition supported by the Gabrielites and the Messianic voices, the Gabrielites being a almost totalitarian Christian group within the Order of Reason, also behind the Templars at some point. All sorts of things going on. The Golden Guild, the first large commercial guild, is being assembled and is on the rise at this point. So what is happening in the supernatural world around this period? What's up with the werewolves, or what's up with the vampires or wraiths or what have you that you know of?
Well, Wraith, I can't really speak of. Wraith never got a Dark Ages book. I don't know enough about Wraith to actually theorize why. So, like I said on the podcast that I have, if there's any listeners who know enough about Wraith, please let me know why that never got a book, but it just didn't. Werewolf, the problem with Werewolf this time is that nothing is really happening. The Dark Ages Werewolf book is an example of an interesting concept that never really got anywhere, because it's not that the werewolves have won, but you're at a time where human civilization and the corruption that it brings is just not at a point where werewolves really have to worry too much about it. So mainly what the werewolves are doing are fighting amongst themselves for prime territory, which in my opinion doesn't make for a very interesting game. So I've always thought that it could be really interesting to see a redo of Dark Ages Werewolf, where you actually managed to have a kind of a real enemy. I think they did a really good job in Werewolf the Wild West, where they had this huge evil spirit called Storm Eater, and that was sort of the big threat among a lot of other things. As for for vampires, this is 1230, where Dark Ages Mage is set. This is the War of Princes, where ancient vampires have graduated from a cold war to a semi-hot war. You had the destruction of Constantinople in 1204, where one of the oldest and most powerful vampires was killed. And this really created sort of a new world order among vampires in Europe. So what you have is very powerful vampires moving their allies and their pawns into position at the same time as you have all of these new opportunities opening up: the universities, the emergence of free cities, of large cities, of trade guilds, of merchants associations. So what the vampires are into at this point is really just grabbing as much as they can. For the Fae, that's quite interesting. It's been a while since I read Dark Ages Fae, but they had this war going on a long time ago, and then they signed a truce, and that truce is coming to an end in 1230. So the focus for them is very much on what's going to happen with the end of the truce. And for everyone, but especially the vampires and the mages, one of the things is the rise and power of the church, the influence that it exerts, and also with the inquisitors. Some of these supernaturals, be they vampires, werewolves, or mages, they're realizing just what the Inquisition might mean for them. So that is also a very, very important thing. And then obviously in the East, you have the Masasa Wars, you mentioned the Tremere, or from what I've learned, apparently it's supposed to be pronounced Tremere, but I've never really been a Latin scholar, so I'm going with Tremere.
Yeah, it's the name comes from Tremere being trembling in fear of death or something like that. But sorry.
We're not Latin scholars, so I think we can go with Vulgar Latin on this one. But at the same time, you still have a war brewing in the East. The reason why Clan Tremere was allowed to establish themselves and not being crushed by the vampiric enemies over there is that they have their own war going on between various vampire clans. And the Tremere pretty much attach themselves to one side and become their magical associates, and they get protection.
And I guess if we were to think about the major things happening in Wraith, I bring this up because when I threw it out to the Discord, one of the questions was, so what's happening in Wraith? A bunch of people were like, yeah, what's happening in Wraith? So the major causes of, let's say, excess death at this time, we have the Crusades that are running for, we're in the middle, not quite in the middle, but close to the middle of a period of the Crusades having run for about 2 centuries. To me, that means that the necropoli of the Holy Land are probably going to be quite full in terms of where that would be. What are kind of the global metropolises at this time, like the great cities of the world during this period?
Obviously, you still have Constantinople, Byzantium. The sack of 1204 really did a number on it, but it's still a major city. You have the major cities of the Crusader days. You have places like Acre and Tripoli, those areas, and pretty much further east you move, the more large cities you encounter. You have places like Timbuktu in what will become soon the Malian Empire. You have places like Marrakesh and Fez and other North African cities. Then you have the Italian city-states, the three biggest one being Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. Then you have London and Paris, big cities at this point. And when you move further north, it's actually interesting because I'm a vampire player, and in Vampire, they have this thing like, okay, cities can have one vampire per 1,000 inhabitants, which is kind of interesting because if you go to the country that I live in, Denmark, that would mean like that the biggest city in Denmark at this point could support one vampire. But you have Flanders, have big cities, and in the Holy Roman Empire, Cologne is probably the biggest city, with places like Magdeburg trailing behind. Probably also like Hamburg and Lübeck are starting to become big, and they will become major players in 100 years. But the biggest cities at this point they're all south of the Alps, basically anywhere within a short distance of the Mediterranean coast. That's where you find the really big cities in the area that I know most about. If we go like across the sea to the Americas, I don't know if places like, for example, Tenochtitlan has emerged yet. It's an area that I know very little about, I'm sorry to say.
Not a problem. We're talking about a period roughly 1,000 years ago. I barely know what's going on now. So globally, the world is probably dominated by like Kaifeng, Hangzhou, Baghdad. Fez, Morocco is large. I think at this point, like Palermo, Italy is one of the largest cities in Europe. As you had mentioned, things south of the Alps. So we have the idea that those are the largest cities. Those are probably going to be the largest necropolises within.
Well, if you want a huge amount of deaths, you have the Albigensian Crusade, especially the sack of Foix. That was a lot of dead people. The interesting thing is you also have the Crusades in the Baltics, but there's not a lot of people living there. So yes, a lot of people are being killed in relation to how many people live there, but it's nothing compared to how many people die other places. And in general, I will say one very interesting thing, all of these cities that we've mentioned, especially in Europe, it's important to notice that no city has a natural population increase at this point in time. The only reason why cities can maintain their size and grow is because people are moving in from the countryside, because disease is so incredibly rampant. People are just dying off because imagine you're putting together so many people in a very, very narrow space. I think for a lot of Americans, it's probably difficult to understand just how small these cities were. But if you're European and you live in a city that existed since the Middle Ages, you can often take a walk along where the old city wall would have been. And it's just tiny. Like you could walk across a city in 10 minutes or so. And when you put that many people together with the kind of sanitation and medical knowledge they had back then, people are just going to be dying off. I mean, there's a reason why you often didn't really give a child a permanent name until they turned 5, because that was when you had a reasonable idea that they were going to survive.
Yeah, if disease and warfare are kind of going to be dominant forms, so it seems like the Smiling Lord and the Skeletal Lord are going to be waging a heck of a fight. I think the head of the Emerald Legion is also likely to be quite potent, because back then people just died randomly a lot. It was a remarkably deadly world, says the actuary. So it seems like the big power player in the supernatural world right now is going to be vampires. They're kind of at an apex. The Inquisition hasn't hit yet. This seems to be a period that even contemporary vampires of any history tend to fixate on.
and the height of the Roman Empire. But yeah, the Middle Ages will always be a period where, the Black Plague, that's sort of like, oh, this was when we were great.
So back to Mage, we are centuries before the Order of Reason kind of formally getting together and having the meeting of the White Tower. We are well before the Siege of Mistridge. We are well before the founding of the Council of the Nine Mystic Traditions. What is kind of the organization of the magic world? Like we talk about traditions and conventions now. What is the organization? How do mages kind of clump together in this period?
They are coming off of a time where mystic fellowships, as they were called back then, were very insular. And they're starting to realize that they're going to have to work together. You basically have the organized and the less or disorganized fellowships. You have the Alibateen, you have the Messianic Voices, and you have the Order of Hermes, and they are very organized. And then you have the Old Faith, the Spirit Talkers, and the Valdermen, and they are relatively disorganized. And so there's this idea that the disorganized fellowships, they realize that they have to become more organized in order to survive. And the organized fellowships realize that they're going to have to work together with some of the other fellowships that they might look down upon in order to survive. The one that sticks out, of course, is the Messianic Voices, because they consider themselves a part of the Catholic Church, and thus they're looking at it going, we're probably going to win. But even then, their belief system, their theology, is one that is considered, or would be considered, heretical by the church if they knew they existed. So if ever they're found out, they're not only suspect because of their magic, and I say suspect, not necessarily, bad because of their magic, because at this point, the church recognized the concept of white magic, but they would be suspect because of their magic. They would actually be in bigger trouble if someone were to query them about their theological approach, because that would mark them as heretics instantly. Well, it's kind of difficult to explain without getting a lot into Christian theology, but they adhere to an older approach to Christian orthodoxy, which has been considered heretical by the Catholic Orthodoxy of the 13th century. Basically, they adhere to older beliefs that are no longer in vogue. So that's what marks them out. They have a different approach, and obviously because of their magic, they have a different belief of how you can interact with the divine than the Catholic Church believes possible. They have a more I would almost call it Protestant approach to it, with a personal relationship with the divine rather than going through the intermediary of a priest.
Okay, so we have this core heresy, which is kind of ironic because at this point, the Messianic Voices, who will one day merge with the Mithraic Singers to form the Chœur Céleste, who will eventually become the Celestial Chorus, they are quite dogmatic. They are participating or will be participating in the Inquisition in some way, shape, or form. They are overwhelmingly Christian during this period of time. As of about the 4th or 5th century, most of the Celestial Chorus, most of its leadership positions were Christian in some way, shape, or form, and that just kind of grew and grew as the end of the Second Age approached. Within them, previously, they had a group called the Inner Doctrine, which would later be known as the Cabal of Pure Thought, which believe themselves to be adherents of the Archangel Gabriel, whose goal is to unite mankind under Christianity. What did their magic look like for the Messianic Voices?
Their magic was, to them, basically calling upon and channeling the powers of 4 of the archangels. Obviously, that tended to be viewed through different lenses for different people, but the general belief was that they were in contact with the archangels, and their belief was that since they were doing God's work, whatever they did or to put it another way, whatever happened when they acted was what God wanted to happen. So if they struck down an enemy with holy fire, that is what God wanted to happen. If they failed to strike down someone with holy fire, then that was also part of God's plan. So they had these 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Gabriel, and each of them have sort of a sphere of influence. Michael, obviously, things like battle and leadership, and they would call upon them to gain the powers that they represent. The way that they the foundation that they built upon was, of course, their faith and their belief in God.
And the way magic worked in this period of time, each of these fellowships, you kind of had a core arete stat foundation, and then you had pillars. And
Yes.
Mechanically, when you would do an effect, it would be your pillar plus your foundation, you would roll. And the pillars kind of represented the four corners of what a paradigm could do. And as Jacob said, you had Gavriel, who had dominion over fire, healing, motion, and reason. Michael, who had dominion over leadership, light, and war. Raphael, who had dominion over creativity, peace, and water. And Uriel, who had dominion over darkness, death, fear, and earth. And just like we blend spheres today when playing Dark Ages, you would combine the pillars. Now, one of the things that becomes complicated is it is not unreasonable to encounter a 800-year-old wraith or an 800-year-old vampire. One of the things that happens as reality tightens is it is very hard to be that old in Mage the Ascension. You have Senex, and you have Porthos Fitzempress, and Nicodemus Mulhouse as kind of the three mages that are kicking around in modern times that go back more than a few centuries, and they are kind of enigmatic and distant figures. But in our contemporary games, this can be used as a way to inform maybe more interesting sorceress groups, that if you would like to have pillars and just kind of treat each of those dots as individual effects, much like we do with sorceress groups, or alternatively, you want to go through the effort of combining the two systems together, you can certainly do that. You can also encounter a mage in a umbral realm where maybe time's going differently, or it suits their paradigm, and that is another way to kind of encounter this. I think for contemporary players, the exercise of saying, what is the foundation of your belief and what are the ways that it manifests is still a useful exercise to help a player understand their character's worldview, even if you don't go full-on pillars. We get a lot of requests to say we should bring back pillars, and everything should use that. In my interview with Stephen Michael de Pisa, who wrote many of those pillars, he said it was one of the most difficult writing exercises he ever did, to be able to summarize the entirety of what a paradigm is capable of, and to do it in a few thousand words. So when the person who did the original one said, "This is hard," I am inclined to agree.
I'll also say that pillars work really well within the paradigm of the Dark Ages setting, the medieval. I think they really don't work in modern times because our philosophy and way of thinking is so very, very different from the kind of thinking that people were brought up in the medieval world. We, in general, are taught to be much more broad-minded, much more accepting, and much more willing to either change our paradigm, incorporate new ideas, or entertain the idea that something about our paradigm might not be wrong. Whereas the medieval mindset was just so much more totalitarian. So it makes sense that each fellowship is locked into these pillars that can mix and match. For example, it doesn't really matter if the person being burned is being burned by an order of Hermes who is using his elemental magic, or if he's being burned by a member of the Messianic voices who's calling upon the Archangel of Fire. It's still fire. It's just a different approach to it. So I think pillars, they make more sense in the medieval setting.
So we talked about one religious group. Let's talk about another. The Alibateen, or the Batini, are a group of kind of Arabian mages that are practicing mainly focused on subtlety, which is kind of interesting because you almost don't need to worry about paradox during this period. Do you know what the Alibateen are up to and maybe what their magic looks like?
Their basic approach to magic is the divine unity, this idea that everything is one. They can read minds because in reality, all minds are one. They can teleport because in reality, all places are one. And so they seek this divine unity. It's almost sort of a Buddhist aspect. But what I think is really interesting when you read about them is they obviously have an Indo-Persian origin with Buddhist aspects, but they've really taken to Islam because of Islam's extreme monotheism. So they identify their unity with Allah, but they do it in a way that, once again, would make them heretics to standard Islam at the time. which I also think is quite interesting. And their magic is a kind of faith magic, and it looks like it is faith in Allah and faith in Islam, but in reality, it is faith in their idea of this ideal unity, which to most of them just happens to be expressed through Islam's monotheism.
I like the fact that we have gotten two religious groups, and both of them would be heretical to the mortal groups that they theoretically would interface with. I always like the idea that mages have a belief set that is a little bit different from their mortal counterparts, and maybe if the mortals...
I also like that from the perspective of gaming, because otherwise you end up with, or will have a tendency to end up with, characters that people are familiar with TV tropes. There's a trope called the Templar. And you can very easily end up with people who are like these characters that are these fanatic believers. But when you cast them as heretics, where their core beliefs has to be at odds with the general, shall we say, mortal expression of the religion, then that forces them to rethink how they are. And in that way, you can have people playing Alibateen or Messianic voices who have no problem interacting with what they might see as infidels, because they know that their approach to the religion is considered heretical by the mainstream.
Yeah. And it also prevents the case where this game is not Ars Magica. You are not the hermetic who is in control of a castle that's in control of a region that has domain over Western France or something like that. There is still a need to be mindful in how you do magic, even if the backlash of paradox is not quite the same. So we've talked about the Alibateen, we've talked about the Messianic voices. There's another group with faith in its name, the Old Faith. Who are they and what do they do?
Well, the Old Faith they're almost kind of a cop-out.
Okay.
Me and a friend of mine, we have a podcast called the World of Dark Ages podcast, and we just did the first half of the Mage book. And one of the things I talked about is the Old Faith it seems like the writer said, all right, let's lump all the pagan faith of Western Europe, save one, and we'll get to those, into one group, and then that's it. And they do some interesting things with it. They are these people who believe that they were given the powers by their old gods, be it the Celtic pantheon, be it the Slavic pantheon, whatever, and that is where their power comes from. They managed to not make them a medieval Wiccan group, but it still, to me, seems a little bit like a cop-out that they just throw all of the pagans together. But I do see some great possibilities in them, depending on where you have them, because just about anywhere in Europe you can set your game. You will, of course, have ancient pagan beliefs that people can be in touch with, because as powerful as the Catholic Church is at this point, they haven't managed to stamp out all beliefs. And even in places where they've been in power for a long time, there are still some of the old ways that exists just as folk superstitions that the church is not going to bother getting rid of. But they believe that humanity should be more in touch with the natural world, not necessarily nature. They're not, tree-hugging hippies, but the natural world as in the way the world was intended to be, and that the old gods were the keepers of this balance of the world. And so they are also the keepers of this balance of the world.
So this would probably include historic Slavic belief, Germanic, Pictish, Scandinavian, certain...
Not Scandinavian,
okay.
Interestingly, because there's another fellowship that incorporates the Scandinavian beliefs, which I think we can talk about later, because that's a bit strange, actually.
Nice. And I assume that their magic is seasonal, probably.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Definitely see the direct link to the Verbena with these guys. That's probably, except for the Order of Hermes, this is the most direct link you can see.
spring is tied to life and creation, summer is fire and passion, autumn is wisdom and coming to fruition, and winter is the power of death and despair. And so we've talked through a few of these things, and one of the things that leaps out at me immediately, there's a lot that mages just can't do. They have pretty considerable die pools because it's going to be foundation plus pillar, but it doesn't seem to me like the Alibateen are going to be able to create a stone soldier or be able to turn lead into gold. There's going to be a lot outside of every paradigm in a way that isn't quite as common in I'd say M20.
Yeah, it's like within your paradigm, you are more powerful than a modern mage is, especially because paradox, it kind of doesn't even exist. What you get is if you mess up, bad things happen, but that's not because of paradox. That's because you messed up. It's like if you're forging a sword and you hit your thumb, then yeah, you're going to crush your thumb, not because of paradox, but because you messed up and something went wrong. So inside your own speciality, you are very powerful. If you try anything that goes outside of that, then yeah, you can't do that. For example, the quote unquote Viking mages, they really can't mess with someone's fate because it is well known among them that a person's fate is 100% sealed. The time, place, and manner of someone's death cannot be changed even by the gods, whereas the Alibateen are like, fate is mutable. Fate is what we make it. So that's one of the things I really like about this setting is that you have a lot of power within your own fixed belief system, and it's very difficult for you to do anything that falls outside of it.
And you talked about there being a different group for the Scandinavian. What group is that, and kind of what is their magic?
That is the Valdermen, or the Men of Power. And they really confused me when I was reading through it, because I was like, these are pagan mages. Why aren't they a member of the Old Faith? And what we came up with in our podcast was, well, Vikings are cool.
I was about to say, the iron law of RPGs, Vikings are cool.
Yeah, exactly. So they decided that they needed a Viking group, and obviously their power comes from the runes, and I'm not going to go on a rant of how runes actually weren't magical symbols the way people tend to imagine it is, because it works within the setting of the world of darkness that they are magic, but their magic comes from the runes, and they have what I think is a really cool take on Norse magic. And I think if the Old Faith didn't exist, if they spread that out, then the Valdermen would make a lot more sense, because they really embrace the dark nature of Norse magic. And when you look at the sources that we have, which is obviously mostly the Icelandic sagas, where magic is mentioned, then most of the magic, and especially the male magic, tends to be relatively dark. Odin is a sorcerer, and he is not a kindly god. Female magic is sometimes more benign, but they've really embraced the idea of the Valdermen as being these necromancers and these people who you really have to be afraid of, because they are willing to do some really dark stuff with their magic. And I kind of like that. It's a different approach to Vikings that you normally see, where it's usually these very heroic, almost honorable, chivalric warriors, which can sometimes, as a native of Scandinavia, annoy me a little bit.
So can you give me the diet version of your rune rant? Because you are on Mage the podcast, and of places to complain that people aren't using my focus correctly, this is probably one of the best. If you don't want to, okay. I understand.
No, basically what I'll say is go on YouTube, search for Dr. Jackson Crawford. Check him out. He is a professor of Old Norse languages and an expert on runes. And he has done an amazing amount of really cool videos touching, among other things, upon this subject. But I will say that, so if we take the really real world, then the runes were considered nowhere near as magical as people think. But I am okay in a magical world like the world of darkness with them saying that the runes are magical, as long as you don't put a horned helmet on a Viking warrior. Then I'm going to rant a lot.
Understood. And should we ever get to that episode, I look forward to having you back. The closest comparison I can think of is the runes were magical in so much as the phenomenon of writing is magical. I do math for a living, and sometimes I just kind of look at numbers and I'm like, wow, these things do a remarkably good job of describing the world around me, and there's no reason they need to. And in that way, to me, they are magical. The fact that I can transport information across centuries and leagues using text is still kind of amazing to me at times. The fact that like one of the books in my library is a rough translation of something from the year 1200, I think that's kind of cool. So to me, whenever people are like, the runes are magic, I'm like, magical in an anthropological sense, in their ability to transmit information. Yeah, that's the way that has me not choke you during a party.
It's much in the same way that smiths were originally considered wizards, because the working of metal was so arcane to other people that it was seen as magic.
That is my relationship with people who can make Southern-style biscuit doughs. That is, I have tried any number of times, and the best I can do is a hardtack sea biscuit. It sounds like you're fine kind of with the Valdermen, and if anything, it would be great if the Old Faith had been expanded maybe into more groups that took advantage of what I imagine is the rich pagan history of the groups that were kind of lumped into what eventually became the Verbena.
Yeah, exactly.
Do we have another group that is kind of tied to, I guess you could say, pagan beliefs and maybe spiritualism or animism?
Yes, we have the Spirit Talkers, and they might actually be my favorite of the Mystics Fellowships, if for nothing else than the fact that they take the idea of shamanism and animistic beliefs and they place them squarely in Western Europe, because there is an unfortunate tendency among white people, and I am white, so I can say white people, but there is an unfortunate tendency to imagine shamanism and animism as being the path of the noble savages, the Native Americans and the steppe people of Asia and the people of sub-Saharan Africa. But no, animistic and shamanistic beliefs did exist in Europe, and they also make them interesting because they say, yes, this is an ancient group whose beliefs have mostly died out in Western Europe. However, some of their beliefs have been rekindled with people who, instead of speaking with animistic nature spirits, they believe that they speak with angels or with the spirits of the dead. So in that sense, they can still be in the Christianized Western Europe. And I just think that is such an amazing approach to it. They really are cool. I think their magic is cool. I think their whole approach to magic really, really interesting. So they're one of my favorite Mystic Fellowships.
And kind of, what is the organizing principle for them? So we talked about the pillars. What are the pillars for the Spirit Talkers?
Well, they have, let's see if I can remember. There's the chieftain, the warrior, the trickster, and I can't remember what the last one is, but they have these totemic, these archetypes that they draw upon. And obviously by 1230, a lot of this has died out, but you still have, if you go to the north of Scandinavia, you have the Sami people who are reindeer nomads. They will still have these beliefs. And obviously among the Mongols, you have the beliefs. And in Siberia, you have these beliefs. I will make a recommendation if people can find it. There is a limited run comic book that was written, I'm old, I think it's like 15 years ago or something like that, called Muktuk Wolfsbreath, Hard-Boiled Shaman. If ever you want to play a shamanistic character that is different in a mage game, find that comic book, Muktuk Wolfsbreath, Hard-Boiled Shaman. He has a spirit familiar that is a drunk weasel. It's basically a noir mystery, but set in Siberia, and the noir detective is a shaman, and it is amazing, and its depiction of shamanistic magic through a noir lens is hilarious. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, that is listed as having come out originally in 1992.
Oh, good Lord, I'm old.
The first one. Oh, links to this will be in the show notes. And their four pillars were the chieftain, who grants leadership, trickster, who grants deception, the warrior, who grants fury, and the wise one, who grants gifts of ancient power.
Wise one. Yes.
I'm cheating. I have the wiki in front of me.
Yeah. So, my book is out of my reach. I should have had it next to me.
And one of the interesting things is, speaking of the book, the core book for this was not intended to be standalone. It is.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a pretty small book. It's under 250 pages, and it presumes you already know the core rules on attribute plus ability or trait plus trait and how to resolve that. In fact, if you're interested in Drive-Thru RPG, there are the free Dark Ages rules available that you can just have if you are interested in this. That is available as a free PDF. Now, you talked about how one of the least changed groups was the proto.
The Old Faith to Verbena.
Yes. And the other one that you said was the Order of Hermes. And at this point, we have the proper Order of Hermes. I imagine the lineup of houses is probably slightly different. I don't imagine.
Well, they actually don't mention the houses in the core book. I forgot to check. There was one supplement.
Yeah, the grimoire.
I forgot to check if they mentioned the houses there. But I mean, if you want the houses, you can always find them elsewhere. And yeah, these are the old school houses. Obviously, House Tremere is at this point as close to gone as is going to happen. But the rest of the houses are still going strong. Though obviously in the framework of Dark Ages Mage, it's going to be difficult to make them as distinct from each other as they were in Ars Magica, but it's still a very cool way to really personalize your mage. And obviously this is where you have the most opportunity for personalization, simply because they have the more backstory than the others.
This is shortly after the Society of Ether the Proto-Society of Ether has left. House Golo in 1188 has departed under Lorenzo Golo, who first laid hands on the Kitab al-Asir. So this is in a brief period of time after the Society of Ether, or their predecessors have left. So we have House Bjornair on shapeshifting. Bonnie Sages is still around. Kriamon, the enigmatic theorists. House Deadney has been kicked out at this point. Tremere was like, look, a distraction, while hiding his vampirism.
Oh, yes.
House Flambeau is very much practicing war magic. My faves, House Gerbaton, are acting as social diplomats and taking care of mundane affairs. House Mercure is still kicking around. House Marianita with fairies is still a full house. Quasitors are still around. Tremere is undergoing the Misasa War. Titulus is very much being a jerk about everything. And this is and the original House Verdicious is still around. What was kind of the cornerstone of the Hermetic magic at this period?
That is Forma, or the forms. And then they have tried to condense the Hermetic magic into just 4 pillars. And as a result of that, I think at this point in time, the Hermetic magic is probably one of the most powerful ones, especially because they have a pillar that specifically deals with meta magic, manipulating magic. And they have a pillar dealing with all forms of life, be it the human body or the animal body. They have one that deals with the mind, and then they have one that deals with sort of energy and the elements, and then they have the last one, which is the magical power, which is what allows them to do meta magic. So the sort of, if there were ever a conflict, intermage conflict, I would say that the Order of Hermes, they are the one that is strongest, because they're the ones whose paradigm includes that your magic can change magic.
And so the Order of Hermes is probably, as you mentioned, one of the least changed. It's probably a highly hierarchical, very competitive and political organization. You mentioned what their pillars look like. So from my knowledge, there's kind of a core 6. Are there any other fellowships that you think would be running around at this time? Or alternatively, if someone were to say, hey, this is incomplete, what kind of fellowships, what kind of magical practices are happening maybe elsewhere in the world that you think one could make a fellowship out of?
This pretty much covers Europe. You might have what they call minor practitioners or hedge mages. You might have people who've made deals with people they shouldn't have made deals with, or who've made deals with fairies, which is almost the same thing. I imagine the Akashic Brotherhood, or what would become them, are kicking around, pardon the pun, somewhere. And I would say that certainly, like, there are magical practices everywhere. But really, if you want to stay within the confines of Dark Ages Mage, or the Dark Ages setting, which is really focused on Western Europe, the closest thing might be you could definitely do something with Masons, because at this point you have cathedrals being built all over Europe, and you really have the beginning of the whole Masonic idea, and Masons being these people who know the magic of geometry. And you have the beginning of an alchemical idea and guilds of alchemists shooting up. You might be able to do something about this, but other than that, I really think that they've managed to sort of encapsulate the mystical ideas that are prevalent in Europe at this time.
Nice. And if you're a listener out there that happens to be familiar with the magical practices of the rest of the world around this period, by all means, reach out to us. I would love to have that conversation. That is me just being ignorant and not knowing that much about what was happening in the rest of the world. So we've kind of run down the magical practices. One of the things I always find interesting is what would be any, like, umbrood or strange creatures tied to this period? Like, what would be their version of dragons, or what were the weird things in the woods that people could either use as a foundation for a modern creature, or if they wanted to set a thing in this period, just a thing of folklore or rumor that was out there, just weird creatures or odd beings.
One thing you could do is go onto the Storyteller's Vault and buy a book called, it's called Dark Myth and Legend. Yeah. There were some rather interesting ideas. For example, there was the Yale, not a walking university, but a kind of deer that was able to swivel its horns around so that if it lost one of its horns, then it could twist another one around to point at its enemy. But I will say probably my favorite creature that was believed to exist at this point in time is the Bonacon. There was a creature that people believed to exist that was called the Bonacon. And what the Bonacon could do was, not to put too fine a point on it, shit fire, covering a huge area behind it. So if it was ever attacked, it would turn around and it would void its bowels with stinking, burning feces. Where they got this idea, I do not know. But people also believed in the existence that usually a lot of creatures were believed to exist in India or in sub-Saharan Africa. So you had things like manticores and stymphalian birds. But I think the Bonacon rates very high on my list of creatures that I would love to introduce. And basically add the disclaimer, no, seriously, this isn't something I made up. This is something they believed. And just see people's reaction to this thing.
And you've done a fair number of Storyteller Vault publications that kind of have to do with Dark Ages. Are there any that you would like to call out and that I should include in the show notes that might be useful for either a period game or just for people who are more curious about what was going on then?
Well, I would say Dark Myth and Legend, I think it has a lot of things that could be used in a mage game, because I talk about magical items that people believed in at that point, the magic of plants and minerals, and of course, various magical creatures. And then I did a book called Island of the Dead God, which is for Dark Ages Mage. It is set on the island of Rügen, which is in northern Germany on the Baltic coast. And it is a setting where I did my best to allow the incorporation of as many fellowships as possible. So that's one that I think, mage fans would be interested in. I'm actually surprised at how well it sold. Finally, I am a weapons and armor nerd. I absolutely love weapons and armor. And I have a book called The Dark Medieval Armory, which I made because I was really disappointed in the weapons and armor tables that existed in the books. So if you want to see what the weapons and armor technology of the time was, then that's a book that, that I want to call out. Other than that, one thing that might be interesting as well is actually one I did for modern day called Of Northern Twilight, which deals with Jotuns and Draugar. So the enemies of the Norse gods and the reanimated corpses of Norse mythology, which also includes a lot of history. But also, if you want to introduce something new to the world of Dark Ages, then you have a couple of options in that.
So we've talked about people making agreements with things that maybe they shouldn't have. What was kind of the nature of the demonic pact in the Dark Ages? Like, how was Infernalism viewed? Were there other entities like elves that one could promise oneself to around this time? Like, what did Infernalism look like during the Dark Ages?
One very important thing to note is that at this point in time, the Catholic Church, their official position was that witchcraft didn't exist. That's something I think a lot of people don't realize. But if you started yelling about witches, then you're the one who was in trouble, not the people you were accusing. But there was absolutely a belief that you could make deals with infernal forces. And unfortunately, obviously, there was this idea that women were more likely to do it than men, because women were weak-willed and spiteful creatures and all that misogyny, but men did it as well. And it was this whole idea that the demons would offer you something that you wanted in return for your immortal soul. Even attempts to sort of slander the ancient philosophers by saying that they argued with Satan himself. And the people at Paris University would say that, yes, perhaps our great master of rhetoric argued with the devil. We don't dispute that. All we're saying is that he won. But yeah, there was very definite beliefs in this, but it wasn't the kind of witch hunt hysteria that you got later on, and which was actually more on the shoulders of the Protestant church than the Catholic church. Inquisitors didn't hunt witches. Inquisitors hunted heretics.
The foes within your religion are generally what you fear more than strange outsiders in terms of their ability to influence a group.
With the Fae, there wasn't so much pacts with the Fae as more agreements. There was the house brownie that you left some milk out for, and then they would do little tasks for you. And the church never really stepped up against that. So in the real world, there wasn't much of a belief in pacts with the fair folk, but especially the way Dark Ages Fae is made in the world of darkness, there would definitely be pacts with the Fae, because that's one of their sort of key things, is the pacts they make with mortals.
So we've talked about kind of the major sources that are available within the world of darkness. You have Dark Ages Mage, you have the Dark Ages Grimoire, you have Dark Ages Darkening Sky, we have the work that you've done in the Storyteller Vault. All of that will be linked in the show notes. Do you have any other recommendations on how someone can get an idea of what kind of the world looked like during this era? Are there any other media or TV shows or books that you think do a good job of maybe delivering on the history so far as you know?
Just to toot my own horn a little bit, I do have a podcast with a good friend of mine called the World of Dark Ages podcast, where we go through each of the books of the Dark Ages line, and what we talk about is the book both as a gaming resource, but also the history that is being described in the book. Is it accurate, and what other interesting things were happening in this area at this time? If you can stand the fact that we tend to ramble off on weird tangents from time to time, then I would recommend that. Other than that, I love various historical YouTube channels. The ones that I follow tend to skew towards arms and armor, but there are a lot of channels out there that can give you a lot of good information. There's especially one called Lindy Beige, where there are a few videos that touch upon this subject, and a lot of other interesting videos. I would also highly recommend a YouTuber called Todd Cutler. He has a YouTube channel called Todd's Workshop. Today, I saw a video where he was just showing the battlements of Dover Castle, which are smack bang in this period, which was really interesting. But basically, once you start down the rabbit hole of history YouTubers, you're going to find quite a lot. As for books, one of the things that I find actually describes the medieval period the best are the various medieval murder mystery books, probably the most famous one being the Brother Cadfael stories, which take place about a century, I think, before this. These medieval murder mystery books, the authors tend to be really, really into describing historical accuracy, and anything written by Bernard Cornwell. Basically, if he's written it, then it's good. When it comes to things like movies and TV shows, they're really good for cinematic value, but I have to switch off my history knowledge when watching them, because Hollywood doesn't really care that much about accurate history. They care more about portraying a cool story.
And that we can certainly understand. And links to everything that Jacob has mentioned, including to Jacob's podcast, will be in the show notes.
Well, thank you very much.
Gladly. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, is there any final bit of wisdom for people to keep in mind when they're trying to think Dark Ages?
Two things. Number one, don't worry too much about it. I happen to be a history nerd. I happen to be willing to spend a lot of my time doing history research. I actually like and love doing history research. I'm the kind of person, I have in my library a book about the martial etiquette in northern Germany during the early modern period, which basically describes the culture and laws regarding weapon and armor ownership in Germany in the late Middle Ages. That's the kind of books I think are fun to read. It is exceedingly dry. So basically, don't worry too much about doing research. But on the other hand, do enough research to avoid the pit traps. I think people are waking up to the idea that the history being portrayed in movies and TV shows will always be subservient to drama. So avoid what might be called the Dung Ages or the Dark Ages. Realize that this was a very interesting, vibrant period. If you just spend half an hour on even Wikipedia, you will get usually a more interesting understanding of this world. But you're never really going to be able to understand the medieval mindset because it's just so alien to ours.
Thank you so much for that descriptor. When we think Dark Ages, I will now think Jacob. Jacob, thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. And if you ever want to talk history again, I'm more than happy to do so. I might tend to get a bit ranty about it, but it's just because it's something that I love so much.
Awesome. I certainly appreciate the passion. Links to all the YouTube channels and books Jacob mentioned, as well as to his show, are in the show notes, which are available at magethepodcast.com. Also, if you listen on Spotify, I usually include a poll just for funsies with most episodes. Feel free to reply to my nonsensical requests, like my recent one asking whose beard sounded better, Josh Heath's or mine. Also, longtime community members and Changeling enthusiasts Joss H. and Puka G have started a podcast creatively named Changeling the Podcast. Link to it is in the show notes. It's about Changeling. I look forward to coming up with an excuse to talk with them about something. This has been Mage the Podcast, where I totally remembered that Nicodemus Mulhouse was a sorcerer and not an awakened mage. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and those supporters are Regina O'Reilly, Oracle of the Pillar of Microphone Quality, Buck Farmer, Oracle of the Pillar of Pre-Show Outlines, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Pillar of Removing Ums and Tidying the Sound as You Go, Jay Widener, Oracle of the Pillars of Good Show Notes, and Mikhail, Oracle of the Pillars of a Post-Show Cheese Plate. Also, Alex, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris P., Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Simsek, L.A. Godsporn, Gargle Lenoir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Eable, Isabel Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G., Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinheimer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out is to Christopher Phillips. Christopher and I think, have argued on the Discord over philosophy, and sometimes we get to some pretty obscure points. So I wanted to do a shout-out consisting of an esoteric philosopher, but realized esoteric philosophy is kind of already a thing. So I tried to find an esoteric philosopher, and everyone I found had dozens of forum arguments citing still yet more esoteric philosophers. I was going to go for obscure, but I didn't want to sound too much like a hipster. So I'm just going to say, thanks for introducing me to Rolf Mettertumpf, who is totally a philosopher, and I didn't just make their name up. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hoppin' Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Now, go change reality. Bye.